Welcome back to Shadowed Pages, my dear friends. I'm Edward, and I'm truly delighted to have you join me once again this evening. Where are you tuning in from today, and how has your day been? I always enjoy hearing from you. Leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for a new mystery every day. Now, let's begin. The early morning mist still clung to the Croquet lawn, a faint chill in the air as Miss Marple made her way across the perfectly manicured grass, her steps slow and deliberate. The once picturesque garden, so lively with laughter and clinking glasses at the previous evening's party, now stood eerily silent. The faintest scent of lavender drifted from the nearby bushes, but it was the thick, unspoken tension that truly filled the air. Her mind was sharp, always observant, as she took in every detail, the arrangement of the croquet mallets left haphazardly on the grass, the pale pink ribbon still tied around the handle of one, a sign of someone having played just moments before. But it wasn't these small things that drew her attention. No, it was the larger scene that unfolded before her, an overturned chair near the garden bench, the crispness of the grass where the body of the late Lord Hargrave now lay. He had been a man of stature, with a reputation so solid that it could withstand almost anything, or so it seemed. A man who, for all his wealth and standing, had secrets, just like everyone else. And now, sprawled out on the ground, his body still as death itself, he was no longer a man of intrigue, but one of mystery, a riddle that needed solving. Miss Marple crouched down beside the body, her eyes studying him carefully. Lord Hargrave's face was pale, his eyes wide in an almost pleading expression, as if in the final moments of his life he had seen something that terrified him. There were no obvious signs of violence, no blood, no bruises, but the way his arms were spread out at odd angles, his legs stiff, suggested a sudden collapse. He had not been prepared for this end. Yet there was something strange about the scene. It didn't feel right. Miss Marple stood up and looked around. The guests had scattered, of course, after the discovery. Their faces were painted with confusion and fear. Most of them had left in a hurry, none willing to linger. Only a few remained, waiting for the authorities to arrive, their nervous glances toward the body betraying their discomfort. Miss Marple's mind ticked through the possibilities, each one more unlikely than the last. She recalled her brief conversation with the butler earlier that morning, how Lord Hargrave had seemed agitated, his mind clearly elsewhere. Was it possible he had been struck by something in the night? But what or who would have done it? And why so publicly? Why here, in the very place where he had entertained his guests? "Miss Marple, you're looking quite pensive," a voice said behind her, and she turned to find the police inspector, Derek Faraday, standing at the edge of the lawn. He had been a long-time acquaintance of hers, though their paths rarely crossed outside of these kinds of unfortunate circumstances. His eyes were tired, but there was a sharpness to them that made her believe he was already deep into his own line of thought. "I'm thinking, Inspector," she said slowly, "that this is not the scene of a simple accident. Lord Hargrave may not have been murdered in the traditional sense, but I do believe someone meant for him to die." Faraday raised an eyebrow, a flicker of curiosity passing through his otherwise calm demeanor. "You think it was intentional, then? But why not leave more evidence? Why make it seem like a simple fall?" "That," Miss Marple replied, "is exactly why it's not what it seems." The inspector frowned. He looked at the body, his gaze searching, then turned back to Miss Marple. "I suppose you've got a theory, then?" "Indeed," she said, her voice firm. "But I won't make any assumptions just yet. I need to see the house. There might be something inside that holds the key to unlocking this puzzle." Faraday hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "All right, Miss Marple. Lead the way." They made their way toward the grand entrance of the house, the stone steps leading them into a cold, imposing hallway. The once vibrant colors of the house seemed muted now, the grand chandeliers casting shadows on the walls. Miss Marple paused just inside the doorway, her eyes scanning the interior with the quiet precision she was known for. There were no signs of forced entry, no disarray. It seemed an ordinary morning after an extraordinary event. The house had been meticulously maintained, a testament to Lord Hargrave's meticulous nature. His wealth had allowed him to keep things in perfect order, but now that order seemed like a mockery. As she moved deeper into the house, she noticed something odd. A faint smell of cigar smoke in the air, out of place among the otherwise clean, fresh aroma of the house. Lord Hargrave never smoked cigars inside, Faraday remarked, as if reading her thoughts. He had a smoking room. His guests were never allowed to light up in the house. Quite so, Miss Marple said, eyes narrowing. Then someone has been here recently. Someone who doesn't follow the rules. Faraday gave her a questioning look, but she didn't wait for him to respond. She continued through the hallway, her footsteps quiet on the wooden floors. The house was silent, save for the faint creaks of old timber shifting. The stairs leading to the upper floors seemed to groan underfoot, but Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere. She had noticed a slight gleam from the corner of her eye, something metallic just out of view. It was a small pocket watch, discarded carelessly on the side table by the door. She picked it up, her fingers brushing against the cool metal. It was an old piece, intricately designed, with an engraving on the back that she could just make out in the dim light. For the one who holds my heart. Faraday stepped closer, his gaze flicking between the watch and Miss Marple. What do you make of it? She held it up to the light, inspecting the delicate craftsmanship. It's a clue, Inspector, a personal one. Who would have left it? Faraday asked. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Her mind was already piecing things together, but there was still something missing, a thread she needed to pull on and to reveal the truth. She turned the watch over in her hands once more, feeling the weight of its significance. It wasn't just a trinket. It was a message. But who was it for? And who was it from? The house, with its tall windows and ivy-clad walls, seemed to hold its breath as Miss Marple made her way down the corridor, the soft click of her shoes on the wooden floor the only sound. The faint smell of cigar smoke lingered in the air, adding to the strange, unsettling atmosphere that had descended upon Lord Hargrave's estate. Every corner, every shadow seemed to hold some secret, as if the house itself had conspired with the tragedy unfolding in its garden. Miss Marple paused before a door at the end of the hall, her eyes narrowing as she took in the small detail that had caught her attention earlier. A mark on the brass handle, slightly worn, suggesting someone had turned it often. She pressed her hand against the cool surface and gently pushed the door open, the quiet creak of the hinges echoing in the silence. Inside, the room was exactly as one might expect of a man of Lord Hargrave's station. A study lined with shelves of books, a large mahogany desk with a few scattered papers, and a single armchair facing the window. The morning light spilled in, casting long shadows across the floor, but Miss Marple's gaze was fixed on a small object on the desk. It was an envelope, its edges frayed as though it had been handled repeatedly. The wax seal had been broken, but not completely. There was an odd precision to the break, almost as though it had been done in haste, yet carefully. Miss Marple reached for the envelope, her fingers brushing against the smooth paper as she lifted it. She knew that the answers often lay in the smallest of details, the things others overlooked. She unfolded the letter inside, her eyes scanning the words written in elegant script. The letter was brief, but to the point. It spoke of a meeting, one that had been arranged under the guise of business, but had, in fact, been far more personal. Lord Hargrave had been summoned to this very room by someone, a name that Miss Marple had not yet seen, though the message hinted at a history, a connection that went beyond mere acquaintance. The writer spoke of a long-standing disagreement that had come to a head, a confrontation that would settle matters once and for all. The tone was clear. This was not a mere letter of invitation, but one of ultimatum. Miss Marple's mind turned over the words, her sharp, eyes taking in the finer details. The handwriting was familiar, though she couldn't place it just yet. But she knew one thing for certain. It wasn't from one of Lord Hargrave's usual associates. This was someone who had come into his life recently, someone with a purpose, and that purpose seemed to have been to push the man toward a final, fateful decision. The letter, though important, did not explain everything. Miss Marple set it aside carefully, her mind already moving ahead. She turned to survey the rest of the room. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no papers scattered on the floor, no evidence that anything had been taken or tampered with, but something about the neatness of it all felt off, as though Lord Hargrave had been in the midst of an intense moment, yet had paused to arrange things as if preparing for the inevitable. She stepped over to the desk, her eyes catching the glint of something metal on the far side. It was a small, ornate key resting on top of a leather-bound journal. The key was familiar in design, but Miss Marple couldn't quite place it. She picked it up, holding it in her hand for a moment before she gently opened the journal. The pages were filled with neat, orderly writing. Nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, as her eyes scanned the pages, one word caught her attention. Carter. The name stood out like a beacon in the otherwise mundane entries. Carter. Miss Marple could feel her pulse quicken ever so slightly. She had heard that name before. Carter was a businessman, a man whose reputation had always been more enigmatic than his success would suggest. He had dealings in places where few dared to tread, and his association with Lord Hargrave had been an open secret, though not one often discussed in polite society. But what was his role in all of this? She closed the journal and placed it back on the desk, her mind already working through the possibilities. The name Carter was no coincidence. Miss Marple's sharp eyes flicked to the window where the early morning sun was just beginning to climb higher in the sky. The events of the past few hours, the discovery of Lord Hargrave's body, were only the beginning. The letter, the key, and the journal. These were pieces of a puzzle that Miss Marple was beginning to see more clearly, even if she did not yet know how it all fit together. Faraday had been watching her from the doorway, his face impassive but his eyes keen with curiosity. "Anything of interest, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice low but laced with a thread of impatience. Miss Marple turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "There's much more going on here than meets the eye, Inspector. Lord Hargrave was not simply taken by surprise, nor was his death an accident. He was pushed to the edge, and whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Faraday stepped into the room, his boots heavy against the floor. "You're suggesting this was murder?" She gave a small nod. "Yes, Inspector, but not in the way you might think. There's a deeper game at play here, one that involves more than just Lord Hargrave. This letter, the key, the name Carter, these are pieces of a larger story, one that I believe has yet to unfold fully." Faraday looked skeptical but intrigued. "So, you have a theory then?" "I have several," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm but with an unmistakable undercurrent of certainty. "But we must first understand who Lord Hargrave's real enemies were and why this particular day, this particular moment, was chosen." Faraday crossed his arms, his gaze never leaving her. "And you think you can solve this, don't you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I intend to, Inspector. But first, we must follow the clues. They will lead us, if we let them." The day had grown warmer as Miss Marple walked with measured steps back to the Croquet lawn, the stillness of the house behind her pressing in. Her mind, always alert, sifted through the fragments of the puzzle. The letter had raised more questions than it had answered, and now, as the sun climbed higher, it seemed to shine a light on the hidden corners of Lord Hargrave's life. There was something more beneath the surface, and Miss Marple had never been one to rest until she found it. Faraday had followed her without speaking, his silence both a sign of patience and growing curiosity. He had been with the case for hours now, but Miss Marple's presence seemed to shift the atmosphere in a way he couldn't quite explain. The tension had grown since the body was found, a weight that pressed against every word spoken. Lord Hargrave's death had left a void that no one seemed able to fill, and the more Faraday thought about it, the more he realized that what had initially seemed like an isolated event was part of something much larger. The two of them paused at the edge of the lawn, their shoes crunching the grass beneath their feet. Miss Marple bent down and, without touching the ground, studied the marks in the soil. There were faint impressions, the marks of hurried steps, and just beyond them, the faintest trace of a footprint, smaller than a man's, but unmistakably there. The detail was subtle, but to her eyes, it was clear. Someone had been in a hurry, someone who hadn't planned on being seen. The marks, left in the early morning light, told a story. But whose story? "Looks like someone left in a hurry," Faraday said, his voice barely above a whisper, as though the discovery of a simple footprint might carry some deeper significance. "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, straightening and turning her gaze to the house. "But it's not just the footprints that matter, Inspector. It's the direction they point to." Faraday watched as she moved away from the lawn and toward the stone path that led to a side entrance of the house. He followed her, unsure of what exactly she was thinking, but sensing that she was moving with purpose. There was a quiet determination in her steps, and the way her eyes flickered from one detail to another reminded him of a detective at work, piecing together a case that most would have dismissed. When they reached the side door, Miss Marple paused and glanced around, as if checking for any signs of disturbance. The door, though old, had been well maintained, its brass handle polished to a high shine. But the door frame held something that caught Miss Marple's attention. A faint smear of dirt along the edge, barely noticeable but enough to make her pause. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The mark was fresh, as if someone had leaned against the door just moments before. "Someone has been here recently," Miss Marple said quietly, brushing her fingers across the smear, her expression thoughtful. They weren't concerned with being careful. Faraday leaned in, scrutinizing the mark. "And this means? It means that whoever was here wasn't trying to hide their presence," she replied, her tone calm but with an undercurrent of certainty. "They expected to be seen. This wasn't a case of someone sneaking around. Whoever it was, they were confident." Faraday's brow furrowed. "But why? Why would someone so confident leave traces? If they wanted to make sure no one knew they were involved, they'd have been more careful." "Precisely," Miss Marple said, nodding slowly. "But sometimes confidence is a mask. Whoever was here was setting something up. They knew that sooner or later someone would notice." With a final glance at the door, she turned and walked around the side of the house, her steps deliberate. Faraday followed her, his mind working furiously to keep up with her deductions. They reached the rear garden, and Miss Marple's eyes darted to the small shed at the edge of the property, its door slightly ajar. It was a simple structure, nothing remarkable about it, yet there was something about the way the door hung that made her pause. "Do you think they might be hiding something in there?" Faraday asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she approached the shed slowly, her eyes scanning the area around it. The garden was quiet now, the sounds of the earlier morning bustle long faded. She reached out and gently pushed the door open, the soft creak of the hinges breaking the stillness. Inside, there was nothing unusual at first glance. Gardening tools, bags of fertilizer, and empty flower pots. Yet there was a sense of disorder, something out of place. Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes moving over the clutter. It was when she reached the far corner that she stopped. There, tucked behind a stack of unused canvas tarps, was a large wooden crate. It was nearly hidden from view, but its presence wasn't entirely accidental. Someone had tried to conceal it, but not very effectively. Miss Marple bent down, her fingers brushing against the edge of the crate. It was heavy, and the faint scent of something foreign lingered around it, sharp and metallic. She pulled at the top of the crate, the wood groaning as it shifted under her touch. When the lid came free, she gasped softly. Inside the crate, wrapped in dark cloth, was something unmistakable, something that no one would ever expect to find hidden in a garden shed. It was a gun, old but well cared for, its metal surface glinting dully in the fading light. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the weapon, and for a moment, her mind raced. The pieces were beginning to come together, and the truth of it struck her with a quiet force. "Inspector," she said, her voice low, "I believe we've just found the key to Lord Hargrave's death." Faraday stepped forward, his face paling as he looked at the gun. "Do you think—" Miss Marple's gaze was unwavering, her mind already running through the implications. "I think we need to find out who was trying to make sure this was never seen, and why they chose today, of all days, to put their plan into motion." The gun was the answer to something, though what that something was, Miss Marple could not yet say. But she knew one thing for certain. The game had changed, and now the real investigation had begun. Miss Marple stood for a long moment in the shed, her eyes fixed on the gun resting in the crate. The shadows cast by the late afternoon sun stretched across the garden, darkening the corners of the shed, but she remained unshaken. The weapon in the crate seemed to pulse with significance, its presence in the quiet corner of Lord Hargrave's estate a deliberate choice. It was not just an ordinary piece of equipment. It was a symbol, a warning, perhaps even an answer. Faraday was still standing behind her, his gaze flicking between Miss Marple and the gun, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you thinking, Miss Marple?" She didn't respond immediately, her mind moving through the threads of the case. The weapon was old, its design not one found in ordinary homes or places of business, yet it was clearly well cared for. There was a familiarity about it, something that struck her as both out of place and strangely familiar. She could see the care that had gone into hiding it, and yet it had been left just a bit too exposed, almost as though it were meant to be found, just not by the wrong person. Finally, she turned to the inspector, her face impassive, though her eyes held the weight of the discovery. "This is no ordinary crime, Inspector. It's deliberate. Someone wanted us to find this. Eventually." Faraday stepped closer to examine the gun. "But why would anyone leave a weapon like this out in the open like this? Doesn't make sense. If it were part of the murder, it would have been hidden better." "That's the point, isn't it?" Miss Marple replied, her voice quiet but firm. "Whoever left it here wanted us to find it, but at the right time. They didn't expect us to uncover it so soon. Not right, after the murder. It's a message, Inspector, though I suspect it's one that comes much later than we expect." Faraday didn't immediately respond, his face thoughtful as he looked down at the gun. His hands hovered over it as if unsure of how to approach it. "Do you think this has something to do with Carter?" The mention of the name caused a flicker in Miss Marple's gaze. She had been turning the name over in her mind for hours, trying to make sense of it. Carter was the key to this, but how did he fit into all of it? She'd known of him before. Rumors had followed him like a shadow for years, a businessman whose ventures straddled the line between the legal and the dubious. But Lord Hargrave, why would someone like him be entangled with a man like Carter? "I do," she said slowly. "But it's not just Carter. It's something larger than that. Lord Hargrave's dealings with him weren't just financial, they were personal." Faraday's expression shifted, a mix of intrigue and skepticism. "Personal? How?" Miss Marple turned and began walking back toward the garden, the cool evening breeze lifting the strands of her gray hair. "Carter is a man with enemies, people who would do anything to see him fall. Lord Hargrave may have been one of those people, or perhaps he was part of a larger scheme, Either way, the gun tells me something about their relationship, something more than just business. Faraday followed her, his eyes still on the shed behind them. And you think someone used Lord Hargrave to get to Carter? I think someone used Lord Hargrave to cover their own tracks, she said, her voice steady but filled with certainty. This murder wasn't about Lord Hargrave at all. It was about Carter, and now someone wants us to find the pieces that tie it all together. They reached the Croquet lawn again, the scene of the crime still heavy with the presence of the victim. The body of Lord Hargrave had been removed, but the lawn still felt haunted by his absence. The place where he had fallen was marked only by a few stray patches of grass, crushed underfoot by the hurried movements of the guests and the police. Miss Marple paused for a moment, letting her eyes sweep over the area as if searching for a detail that had been missed. "We'll need to find out more about Carter," Miss Marple continued, her gaze still fixed on the ground. "But we also need to know who else had access to the house that day. Someone left the side door open. Whoever it was, they knew exactly what they were doing." Faraday nodded. "I'll talk to the staff. There's a chance one of them saw something." Miss Marple glanced at him, her eyes sharp. "Don't just talk to the staff, Inspector. Talk to the people who knew Lord Hargrave best, his associates, his friends, anyone who might have been privy to his dealings with Carter. Those are the people who will give you the answers." Faraday looked at her, his face clouded with thought. "I'll see what I can find. But do you really think this is just about Carter? I mean, Lord Hargrave was wealthy, influential. Maybe someone just wanted him dead for his money or power." Miss Marple shook her head. "That's too simple, Inspector. Lord Hargrave had power, yes, but not in the way you think. He wasn't a man driven by wealth, but by something deeper, something connected to Carter, something that we haven't yet uncovered. It's a thread, Inspector, and we're only beginning to pull at it." Faraday stood in silence for a moment, watching her as though trying to gauge her certainty. There was no doubting her resolve, and though he didn't fully understand her conclusions, he couldn't deny that she had a way of seeing things others couldn't. "You're sure about this?" he asked. "I'm sure," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but firm. "And now, we need to follow the trail, no matter where it leads us." Faraday gave a slight nod, his skepticism momentarily replaced by a quiet respect. "All right, Miss Marple, we'll do it your way." With that, he turned to leave, his footsteps light on the grass. Miss Marple watched him go, her gaze lingering on the Croquet lawn one last time. There were pieces here, scattered like the remains of a broken puzzle, but she knew that in time they would come together, revealing the truth hidden in the quiet corners of Lord Hargrave's life, and Carter's secrets. The next morning dawned with a heaviness that seemed to settle over the entire estate. The sky was an unbroken slate of grey, the clouds heavy with the promise of rain, yet the air was still. Miss Marple sat at a small table by the window, the steam from her tea rising in delicate tendrils, though her mind was far from the comforting warmth of the cup. Instead, it rested on the gun, the letter, and the name that had haunted her thoughts. Carter. The morning had brought no new revelations, only more questions. Faraday had spoken with the staff, but there was nothing of note from them. No one had seen anyone enter or leave the house at the time of Lord Hargrave's death. No strange visitors, no unusual comings or goings. It was as if the murder had been an event without a witness, planned in secrecy and executed without trace. Yet Miss Marple knew that secrets never stayed hidden for long. There was always a thread, however faint, that could be pulled to unravel the truth. She had spent the better part of the morning revisiting the scene of the crime, hoping that the cold silence of the Croquet lawn might whisper something she had missed. But there was nothing. Nothing except the overwhelming stillness, as though the ground itself had been complicit in the tragedy that had unfolded there. Miss Marple took a slow sip of her tea, her eyes narrowing as her thoughts turned back to Carter. Lord Hargrave's connection to him was becoming clearer, but the deeper she delved, the more complicated it became. Carter's name had appeared in the letter she had found in the study, but it was clear that his relationship with Lord Hargrave was fraught with tension. Was it business or something more personal? Miss Marple suspected it was the latter, but until she could find a way to prove it, she would have to move carefully. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and she turned just in time to see Faraday step into the room, his expression weary but determined. "Miss Marple, we've found something," he said without preamble. She set down her cup and motioned for him to continue. "What is it?" Faraday hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure how to present what he had uncovered. Finally, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He handed it to her, and Miss Marple took it, unfolding it carefully. It was a receipt dated just a few days before Lord Hargrave's death. It was for a purchase made at a local jeweler in the village, but what caught her attention was the name at the bottom, Carter. He had bought a ring, an expensive one by the looks of it, though there was no indication of whom it was intended for. Faraday watched her closely as she read over the receipt. "We checked the records at the shop. Carter had the ring specially made, but it was picked up by someone else, a woman named Edith Palmer. She's a local, runs a small antique shop near the village square. The shopkeeper didn't think much of it at the time, but now it seems odd." "Odd indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her mind already turning over the significance of the purchase. A ring. A gift, perhaps. But why was it bought so close to Lord Hargrave's death? And why had it been delivered by Edith Palmer? Miss Marple knew of the woman. She was well known in the village, though not necessarily for any respectable reasons. There were whispers about her, rumors of debts and troubled dealings, but nothing concrete. She was someone who had been able to keep her past at bay, at least for the most part. "Have you spoken to Mrs. Palmer?" Miss Marple asked, folding the receipt carefully and slipping it into her pocket. "We plan to," Faraday replied, his expression grim. "But she hasn't been at her shop today. She's missing." Miss Marple stood up, her eyes narrowing. "Of course she is. She's part of this, Inspector. I don't know exactly how yet, but she is." Faraday looked at her, his brows furrowing in confusion. "You think she's involved in Lord Hargrave's death?" "I don't think she killed him, no," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm. "But I do believe she knows something important, something that could link Carter to Hargrave in a way we haven't seen yet." Faraday ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. "I don't understand. What's the connection? Why would a woman like Edith Palmer be involved in something like this?" Miss Marple gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "That, Inspector, is precisely what we need to find out, and I believe Edith Palmer holds the key. We're going to need to pay her a visit." The air was thick with anticipation as they left the house and made their way toward the village. The journey was short, but the silence between them was heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. Faraday's thoughts seemed to be in turmoil, but Miss Marple's mind was clear, each step a movement toward uncovering the final piece of the puzzle. They arrived at the antique shop in the village square, a small, charming building with a faded sign that hung above the door. The windows were dark, and the door was locked. Miss Marple stood for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the quaint storefront. There was something about it that didn't sit right with her, a sense that things were not as they appeared. She turned to Faraday, who had already stepped up to the door. "She's been here recently," Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful. "We may find something that tells us more about her involvement in all of this." Faraday nodded, his fingers pressing against the door frame as if testing the strength of the lock. "Let's see what we can find." The door opened with a soft creak, revealing the dusty interior of the shop. The shelves were filled with all manner of old things, cracked vases, tarnished silverware, faded paintings, but there was something more here, something that didn't belong. A single drawer in the back of the shop was slightly ajar, and Miss Marple's eyes were immediately drawn to it. She crossed the room in a few quick strides and pulled the drawer open. Inside, nestled among a collection of old papers and trinkets, was a small velvet pouch. Miss Marple's fingers trembled as she reached inside and pulled out a ring. A ring identical to the one on the receipt Faraday had shown her. The weight of it, the feel of it in her hand, confirmed her suspicions. It wasn't just a gift, it was part of a scheme. And now they were one step closer to understanding what had really happened on the Croquet lawn. The discovery of the ring had settled into Miss Marple's mind like a puzzle piece clicking into place. She could feel the threads of the case stretching further, weaving a tapestry that was growing increasingly complicated, but also clearer in its direction. She held the ring carefully in her hand as Faraday watched her, his eyes narrowing with growing understanding. They had found something important, but what was it? Miss Marple pocketed the ring, her mind already running through the possibilities. The connection between Edith Palmer, Carter, and Lord Hargrave was beginning to form, though the details still eluded her. She needed to know more about Edith Palmer's past, more than the village gossip could provide. There was something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface of this small, seemingly insignificant shop. It wasn't just about the ring. It was about what it symbolized, about the silent transactions that had taken place in the shadows. Faraday's voice broke through her thoughts, his tone heavier than before. So, what now? We have the ring, but that doesn't explain much. Miss Marple looked at him, her eyes sharp as ever. We need to find Edith Palmer, Inspector. We need to understand why she had this ring and why she was hiding it. Someone wants us to believe it's part of a simple transaction, but I suspect it's something much more. Faraday's skepticism was evident. But you think this is linked to the murder? To Carter? I'm certain of it, Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm. Edith Palmer is the missing piece, and this ring is just the start. Someone wanted to keep us from finding out about her involvement, but I think we've just uncovered the first clue. It's all connected. They both stood in silence for a moment, each absorbed in their own thoughts. But Faraday, still clearly unsure, broke the quiet. How do you propose we find her, then? Miss Marple had already been considering this. Edith Palmer had always been a figure on the outskirts of village life, someone who kept to herself but had a certain reputation. If Miss Marple had learned anything in her years of quiet observation, it was that people like Edith Palmer left traces, even if they tried to hide them. There was always someone who knew something, and someone who could be persuaded to speak. We need to go back to the village, Miss Marple said. We'll start with her neighbors, perhaps. There may be someone who knows where she's gone, or at least something more about her recent behavior. Faraday nodded, though he looked like he'd rather pursue a more direct approach. I'll ask around. It's just that I don't see how this all fits together. Lord Hargrave, Carter, Edith Palmer. Why is she involved in this mess? Miss Marple gave him a small, knowing smile. That, Inspector, is exactly what we need to discover. The village was just a short walk from the estate, and they arrived shortly after, the winding streets lined with old cottages and ivy-covered buildings. There was a quaintness to the village, a peacefulness that belied the tension now sitting heavy on its heart. Faraday and Miss Marple made their way to the small row of cottages near the village square, where Edith Palmer's shop was located. It had been quiet when they arrived, the usual bustle of village life subdued in the wake of the murder. The first few neighbors they spoke with knew little about Edith's whereabouts. She had disappeared the night of Lord Hargrave's death. No one seeing her leave, but everyone knowing she hadn't returned home. That evening, the gossip had spread like wildfire. Edith Palmer had been seen leaving the party at Lord Hargrave's estate, but no one had seen her since. She was known for her late hours, for the occasional disappearance when business or personal matters took her elsewhere. But this time it felt different. This time, no one could place her. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, her eyes darting between the cottages as she considered her next move. It wasn't so much that Edith Palmer had vanished. It was the fact that no one had noticed anything unusual about it. There was no urgency in their voices, no panic. It was almost as though Edith Palmer had simply slipped away, as if she had planned it all along. Faraday's patience was running thin, his usual confidence slightly strained. "There's no one who knows anything," he muttered, frustration creeping into his voice. "We're chasing ghosts." Miss Marple turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "That's because you're looking in the wrong place, Inspector." Faraday raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "People know things, even when they don't want to," Miss Marple said softly, her voice quiet but full of conviction. "We just need to find the right person to talk to." She led the way down a narrow street, her eyes scanning the faces of those she passed. There was a sense of unease in the air, a subtle shift in the way the villagers interacted with her. Some glanced away, others stiffened as she walked past. It was a reminder of how quickly things could change when one became involved in matters that others preferred to avoid. When they reached the end of the street, Miss Marple stopped at a small, unassuming cottage, its windows slightly ajar, the curtains fluttering in the breeze. She knocked lightly, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes calm and unassuming. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with a sharp gaze that seemed to see straight through Miss Marple. "Yes?" the woman asked curtly, though her voice lacked any real warmth. Miss Marple smiled politely. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Edwards. I hope I'm not disturbing you." The woman didn't answer immediately, but the moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken recognition. Mrs. Edwards was a woman of the village who had seen everything, remembered everything, but rarely spoke of it. "I'm looking for Edith Palmer," Miss Marple said gently. "I believe you might know where she's gone." Mrs. Edwards stiffened, her lips tightening into a thin line. "Why do you want to know about that woman?" she asked, her voice laced with a quiet suspicion. "Because I believe she knows something important," Miss Marple replied, "and I think you might be the one to help us find her." There was a long silence before Mrs. Edwards stepped back, opening the door just enough for Miss Marple and Faraday to step inside. The warmth of the cottage was a sharp contrast to the cold air outside, and as they entered, Miss Marple could sense that something was different. The air was thick with the smell of herbs and old wood, but it was the small, subtle change in Mrs. Edwards's demeanor that caught her attention. The old woman knew something, and she was about to reveal it. The door creaked shut behind them, and the air inside the cottage felt thick, heavy with the weight of something unsaid. Mrs. Edwards led them down a narrow hallway, her footsteps soft against the wooden floorboards, but her movements seemed deliberate, as though she were carefully choosing each step. The cottage was modest, but its age and the sense of history in the air suggested that it had seen many secrets in its time. Miss Marple's eyes wandered over the walls, taking in the faded photographs, the yellowing curtains, and the faint smell of lavender and dust that lingered in the corners. There was nothing unusual about the room they entered, except for the quiet tension that seemed to settle over everything. Mrs. Edwards gestured for them to sit, and they took their places in the mismatched chairs around a small, worn table. The old woman's face was lined with age, but her eyes held a sharpness that Miss Marple had come to recognize in those who had seen and understood more than most. She was used to watching, to observing, and her silence now was a reflection of her careful calculations. "I don't know what you think you'll find," Mrs. Edwards said, her voice low and almost resigned. "But Edith Palmer's a woman with a past, and it's not something she's keen on sharing. She's always been good at hiding things, keeping her distance from the rest of us." Faraday leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued. "We're not interested in her past, Mrs. Edwards. We're only trying to find out what happened to her. She's gone missing, and she may know something about Lord Hargrave's death." The mention of Lord Hargrave's name caused Mrs. Edwards to stiffen, her fingers tightening around the edge of the chair. Miss Marple noted the shift, the subtle flicker of something in the old woman's eyes. Fear, perhaps, or guilt, or both. It was a small change, but it was enough. "I don't know what you're implying," Mrs. Edwards said after a long pause. "But Edith has her reasons for keeping to herself. I've lived in this village long enough to know that some things are best left alone." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her voice remained firm. "I understand that, Mrs. Edwards. But sometimes, silence can be more dangerous than the truth. You can help us avoid a great deal of unnecessary harm by telling us what you know." For a long moment, Mrs. Edwards said nothing, her eyes fixed on the table as though weighing the decision. The silence stretched between them, thick and palpable, until finally she spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "I didn't know much about Lord Hargrave and Edith at first, just that they'd known each other for years, through business, through connections. But Edith's involvement with him, it wasn't just professional. She had something on him, something he didn't want anyone to know." Miss Marple leaned forward, her heart quickening just slightly. This was the opening she'd been waiting for. "What kind of something?" Mrs. Edwards hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if she feared someone might be listening. "I don't know the details," she said, her voice barely audible now. "But it had to do with Carter. Edith and Carter, they were close. Too close. And I think that's why Lord Hargrave—" She trailed off, and Miss Marple leaned in, her gaze intense. "Why Lord Hargrave what?" Mrs. Edwards shook her head as if she regretted even starting to speak. "I don't know the whole story, I don't. But I know Edith went to see Carter the night of the murder. She went to his house in the village and she came back looking, well, not herself. She was different, tense, worried." "Did she say anything?" Faraday asked, his voice edged with impatience. "Anything at all?" Mrs. Edwards pressed her lips together as though trying to suppress the memory. "Not to me, no. But she was acting strange, even for Edith. And then, that night—" She paused again, glancing toward the window as if she expected someone to appear at any moment. "I saw her leave the house right after Lord Hargrave's body was discovered. I don't know where she went, but she wasn't acting right. She was panicked, almost like she was running from something." Miss Marple exchanged a look with Faraday, her mind racing. This was more than she had expected to uncover. Edith's connection to Carter was undeniable, but it wasn't just business. It was something deeper, something that had clearly tangled her fate with Lord Hargrave's in a way that no one had expected. And now, Mrs. Edwards had confirmed that Edith had been involved with Carter on the night of the murder, her actions erratic and suspicious. "Do you think she was involved in Lord Hargrave's death?" Faraday asked, his voice tight with urgency. Mrs. Edwards shook her head quickly, as if the idea was too much for her to contemplate. No, I don't think Edith would have done that. But she's mixed up in something, that's for sure. And I think it's bigger than any of us." Miss Marple sat back, her fingers tapping gently on the table as she processed the new information. Edith Palmer's involvement was clearer now, but it still didn't explain everything. If she wasn't the killer, then what role had she played in Lord Hargrave's death? And what exactly had Carter's role been in all of this? There were too many questions, too many pieces that were still scattered across the puzzle. But one thing was certain. Edith Palmer was at the heart of it all. "I think we need to find Edith," Miss Marple said finally, her voice quiet but filled with determination. "She may be hiding, but she's not hiding from us. We just need to be patient and let the pieces fall into place." Faraday stood up, his face set in a grim expression. "I'll find her, Miss Marple, but we need to be careful. If she's mixed up in this, she could be dangerous." Miss Marple gave him a small, reassuring smile. "I doubt she'll be dangerous, Inspector. She's too afraid of what she knows. But she'll talk, and when she does, we'll have the answers we've been looking for." The air in the room felt still again, as though the weight of the conversation had settled into the very walls of the cottage. Miss Marple stood up and walked toward the door, Faraday following her closely. As they stepped outside into the cool evening air, the quiet of the village seemed to press in on them, heavy with the anticipation of the truth that was still out of reach. But Miss Marple knew that it was close. Closer than ever. They were about to uncover a secret that would reveal everything. The search for Edith Palmer had taken them down every possible avenue, but the village had swallowed her up, her disappearance as complete as the stillness that hung over the streets. Miss Marple had watched the sun dip lower in the sky as they returned to the estate, the weight of the unanswered questions pressing heavily against her chest. Faraday had made inquiries in every direction, but no one seemed to know where Edith had gone. It was as if she had vanished, leaving behind only the faintest traces of her presence. But Miss Marple wasn't ready to give up just yet. She knew that in cases like this, the truth never truly disappeared. It simply hid, waiting to be found. The house had grown quiet as they returned, and Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The staff moved around the estate with an air of restrained nervousness, and even the usually composed Faraday seemed to be losing patience. Yet through it all, Miss Marple's mind remained steady, focused on the trail that was becoming clearer, even if the path was still obscured. As they entered the drawing room, Miss Marple paused, her gaze flickering over the scene before her. There was something different about the room now, as if the walls themselves held their breath, waiting. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting flickering shadows that danced across the polished furniture. The room, so often the scene of social gatherings and polite conversation, now felt heavy with the burden of the secrets it concealed. Faraday had gone off to speak with the rest of the staff once more, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. She sat by the fire, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes distant as she thought about the ring, the letter, and the mysterious connections that continued to unfold. Each piece fit together in its own way, yet the larger picture remained elusive, as if it were just out of reach, teasing her with glimpses of its shape but never fully revealing itself. And then, a small noise broke through the silence, a faint, almost imperceptible sound from the hallway. It was the kind of noise that one might dismiss as nothing, but to Miss Marple's ears, it was the sound of something shifting, something moving in the shadows. Her instincts kicked in, and she rose quietly from her seat, her steps soft as she moved toward the door. She wasn't sure what had drawn her to the hallway, but she felt it in her bones. There was something here, something that had been overlooked. She glanced down the long corridor, the light from the fire in the drawing room casting an amber glow on the floor. Everything seemed still, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances. There was a tension in the air now, a feeling that something important was on the verge of being revealed. She moved down the hall slowly, her eyes scanning every detail. The house seemed to be holding its breath, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned once more to Edith Palmer and the tangled web of connections that had led them to this point. Lord Hargrave, Carter, Edith. She could sense the threads pulling together, but they had yet to form a complete picture. As she reached the end of the hall, she stopped in front of a small door that led to one of the estate's back rooms. The door was slightly ajar, and Miss Marple could see a flicker of movement from within. Her heart quickened, but she remained calm, her curiosity outweighing her caution. She had learned long ago that sometimes the most important revelations came from the quietest moments. Miss Marple pushed the door open with a soft creak, her eyes immediately locking onto the figure standing by the window. It was Edith Palmer. She stood there, her back to Miss Marple, staring out at the grounds. Her posture was tense, her shoulders drawn tight as though she were listening for something, waiting for something to happen. There was no surprise, no shock in her expression as Miss Marple stepped into the room. It was as if she had been expecting her all along. "I was wondering when you'd find me," Edith said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper, but it held a certain finality in its tone. Miss Marple didn't move immediately, allowing the moment to settle between them. There was no rush now. Edith had made her choice. She had come to confront the truth, and now it was time to listen. I didn't mean for things to go this far, Edith continued, her eyes distant as she spoke. But once you start down a certain path, there's no turning back. Lord Hargrave, Carter, they were part of something much bigger than I ever realized. I thought I could control it, keep it hidden, but it got away from me. Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. She had known, of course, that Edith was involved, but hearing it spoken aloud was different. There was something raw in her words, something that spoke of regret and fear, but also of a recognition that the past could not be undone. "Tell me what happened," Miss Marple said softly, her voice gentle but firm. "Tell me why you were involved with Lord Hargrave and Carter." Edith turned slightly, her face half hidden in the dim light, but Miss Marple could see the tension in her features, the way her hands clenched at her sides. "It wasn't just business between me and Lord Hargrave," she said, her voice laced with bitterness. He owed me for things he did, things I helped him cover up. And when Carter got involved, things got complicated. But Hargrave wanted out. He wanted to distance himself from the mess we'd made." She paused, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for something to steady herself. "I didn't want to see him ruin everything we had built, but I couldn't stop him. And then, Carter, he made it clear that if I didn't help him finish what we'd started, there would be consequences." Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice soft but insistent. "Consequences for whom, Edith?" "For everyone," Edith said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "For me, for Hargrave, for all of us. Carter doesn't play by the rules. And I made a mistake. I thought I could control him, but I couldn't. I couldn't stop what was coming." Miss Marple watched her carefully, her mind already piecing together the threads. Edith Palmer had been drawn into something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She had become a pawn in a game that had been playing out for far longer than anyone had realized. The ring, the letter, the secret dealings, all of it had led to this moment. Edith Palmer had not killed Lord Hargrave, but she had been complicit in a web of deceit that had spiraled out of control. "I'm not the one you're after," Edith said, her voice small now, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her. "But I know who is." Miss Marple nodded slowly. She had heard enough. Edith Palmer was not the mastermind behind it all, but she had been a part of something much larger, something that had driven them all to the edge. The pieces were coming together, but the final truth was still elusive, just out of reach. "Thank you, Edith," Miss Marple said quietly. "You've told me what I needed to know." As she turned to leave the room, she felt the weight of the case lifting slightly, the path ahead clearer now than it had been before. But there was still much to uncover. Edith Palmer's involvement had opened a door, but it was still locked with the truth about Carter and the consequences of the choices they had all made. The days that followed were filled with a quiet intensity that Miss Marple had grown accustomed to in her years of solving mysteries. The puzzle, though much clearer now, still held some pieces that refused to fall into place. Edith Palmer's confession had been crucial, but it had opened a new set of questions, ones that Miss Marple knew she would have to answer before the case could be closed. The name Carter hung heavily in the air, a constant reminder that the web of deceit, betrayal, and hidden motives stretched far beyond Lord Hargrave's death. Miss Marple spent her evenings in the study, reviewing every scrap of information she had gathered. The letter, the ring, Edith's account, all of it was part of something much larger, and she could feel the weight of that knowledge pressing on her. She had spoken to Faraday, of course, but he had been preoccupied with other aspects of the investigation, his mind caught up in the practicalities of finding Carter. He had been less patient with the subtleties, less attuned to the quiet details that Miss Marple had learned to trust. The estate was quiet, save for the rustling of the trees outside and the occasional creak of the old house settling into the evening. It was the kind of peace that made her feel as though time itself had stopped, as if the case had taken on a life of its own and was merely waiting for her to uncover its final secret. Miss Marple had spent hours mulling over the pieces, but it was one small detail, a flicker of something she had seen in Edith's eyes, that kept pulling at her. Edith had confessed to her involvement in the dealings with Lord Hargrave and Carter, but there was something in her tone, something hesitant, that suggested she was still hiding something. The way she had spoken about Carter, as if he were both a source of fear and fascination, made Miss Marple wonder just how deep Edith's ties to him really went. And then there was the matter of the gun, the weapon that had been hidden so carefully in the shed. It was a key, Miss Marple knew. But to what? The realization came quietly, as it often did with Miss Marple. Something so obvious, so simple, that it had been overlooked in the rush of everything else. The gun wasn't just a means of violence, it was a message. Whoever had placed it there had known that it would be discovered, that it would lead someone to Carter, to the final piece of the puzzle. But why? Why now? And what was Carter's role in all of this? Was he the puppet master, pulling the strings from the shadows, or was he simply another pawn in the game? She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the questions swirl around her. It was then that she heard the faintest sound, a knock at the door. Her mind snapped back into focus, and she rose from her chair, her movements steady and deliberate. She opened the door to find Faraday standing in the doorway, his expression tense, his eyes shadowed with the weight of a long day. "I've been looking for you," he said, stepping into the room without waiting for an invitation. "I've got news." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, sensing the urgency in his tone. "Go on." "We found him," Faraday said, his voice low. "Carter. He's been hiding out in the old mill outside the village. We had to move quickly, but we've got him now. He's not going anywhere." Miss Marple felt a stir of something deep inside her, a strange mix of satisfaction and dread. Carter, the elusive figure at the center of it all, had finally been cornered. But the truth, she knew, was still elusive. The questions that had been swirling in her mind for days suddenly felt more pressing. What was Carter hiding, and what had driven him to orchestrate everything that had led to Lord Hargrave's death? "Where is he now?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but with an edge of determination. She had known this moment would come, but it didn't make the task ahead any easier. "We've got him in the village, at the old constable's house," Faraday said. "We're holding him there for now. I thought you'd want to be there when we question him." Miss Marple nodded. She wasn't surprised by the sudden move, nor by the idea of interrogating Carter herself. She had seen the way Faraday worked, the way he relied on his instincts and his drive to solve cases, but Miss Marple knew that there were things about people, about their motivations, that he couldn't always see. And Carter, she suspected, was a man whose motives were far more complex than anyone had yet realized. They made their way to the village in silence, the streets empty in the late evening, the shadows stretching long across the cobblestones. Miss Marple's thoughts were consumed with the image of Carter, a man she had never met, but whose presence seemed to loom over everything. The pieces were nearly in place, but there was still a sense of unease in her chest, as if the final answer would shift the moment she thought she had it. The constable's house was quiet when they arrived, the shutters drawn against the dimming light. Faraday led her inside, where Carter sat in a small, dimly lit room, his hands cuffed to a chair. He looked every bit the part of a man caught in the web of his own making, disheveled but composed, his eyes cold and calculating. He didn't react when they entered, as if he had expected them. The tension in the room was thick, and Miss Marple could feel it settling over her like a heavy cloak. She approached him slowly, her steps measured. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, they simply regarded each other, two people on opposite sides of a game that had yet to reach its conclusion. "You're Carter," Miss Marple said softly, her voice steady. The man behind it all. Carter's lips curled into a faint smile, though it was a smile without warmth. "I suppose that's what they're calling me now." Miss Marple sat down opposite him, her gaze never wavering. "Tell me why, Carter. Why all of this? What was the point?" Carter's smile faltered, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a moment of uncertainty. Miss Marple knew that the answers were just within reach, and this time she wouldn't let them slip away. Carter sat in silence, his hands still bound to the chair, his eyes fixed on Miss Marple with a quiet intensity that felt almost predatory. The room was filled with a stillness that seemed to press in on all sides, a tension so thick that it was almost palpable. He had known this moment would come, but now that it was here, he seemed unwilling to break the silence. The weight of his secrets hung heavy in the room, and Miss Marple, ever patient, allowed the quiet to stretch between them. Faraday stood in the corner, watching with an air of impatience, though he knew better than to rush Miss Marple. She worked at her own pace, piecing together the fragments of a case with a precision that was unrivaled. And Carter, it seemed, was no different from any other suspect who thought he could outwit the truth. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but unyielding. "You've been playing a dangerous game, Mr. Carter. All this time you thought you could control the pieces, but now they're closing in on you." Carter's lips curled into a tight smile, but there was no humor in it, only a cold recognition of the truth. "You think you've figured it all out, don't you, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. She simply watched him, her gaze steady, unwavering. "I don't think, Mr. Carter. I know." Faraday shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking between them. "What is it you know, then? We've got him, Miss Marple. What's he waiting for?" But Miss Marple was undeterred. She could feel the unraveling threads pulling tighter, the truth within reach. "The truth is, Carter, you never really had control. Not over Lord Hargrave, not over Edith Palmer, not even over yourself. You were always a pawn in someone else's game." Carter's smile faltered just slightly, his eyes narrowing as he shifted in his chair. "You're wrong," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "I made my own decisions. I played my own hand." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "That's where you're mistaken. You've been manipulated from the very beginning. Lord Hargrave, Edith Palmer. They were both part of your plan, but they were never the ones pulling the strings." The air in the room seemed to grow colder as the pieces fell into place. Carter's facade cracked just enough for Miss Marple to see the flicker of realization in his eyes. He knew exactly where this was heading. "You really don't know, do you?" she continued, her voice unwavering. "The person behind it all wasn't Hargrave, and it wasn't Edith. It was someone you never suspected, someone you thought you could control." Carter's face shifted, his expression darkening, and for the first time, the mask slipped entirely. He leaned forward in his chair, his eyes locking onto Miss Marple with a newfound intensity. "You don't know what you're talking about." Miss Marple remained calm, unflinching. "Oh, but I do, Mr. Carter. You thought you could bury the past, hide your tracks. But it was never about money, or power, or even revenge. It was about one thing, the truth. And now, that truth is finally coming to light." Carter's jaw clenched as Miss Marple's words sank in, the weight of them pressing down on him. He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the window, then back to Miss Marple. For a moment, he looked like a man cornered, trapped by the very web he had spun. Faraday took a step forward, his voice heavy with accusation. "You're saying there's someone else? Someone we've overlooked?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, the one person you never accounted for. The one person who has been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. And I think you already know who it is." Carter's eyes flickered with a brief flash of recognition, but then he quickly masked it, his features hardening once again. "You're delusional," he spat. "I've done nothing wrong. It's all been my decision." "No," Miss Marple said softly but firmly. "You're just a piece in someone else's game, Mr. Carter. A pawn, just like Lord Hargrave, just like Edith Palmer. The person who's been controlling everything is closer to you than you think." Carter's face paled as the realization began to sink in. The truth was undeniable now, and he couldn't escape it. Miss Marple had already pieced together the final part of the puzzle, and she knew what Carter had been trying so desperately to hide. The shadow that had loomed over the entire case, the figure behind the curtain, was the one person who had seemed to be above suspicion all along. "It was you, wasn't it?" Miss Marple's voice was almost a whisper, but it carried with it the weight of certainty. "You thought you could use Lord Hargrave and Edith to cover your tracks, but it was never about them. It was about you. You were the one pulling the strings from the very beginning." Carter's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him as the truth hit him like a tidal wave. He had been too clever, too confident in his ability to manipulate those around him, but in the end, it had all unraveled. And now, with Miss Marple's revelation, there was no escape. "You were using them," Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but unwavering. "Lord Hargrave, Edith, even Carter, everything was part of your plan. You thought you could bury the truth, but it was always going to come to light." Carter's gaze dropped to the floor, and for the first time, the facade of arrogance and control fell away completely. There was nothing left now but the bitter truth, and Miss Marple had exposed it in a single, quiet sentence. "The truth will always come out, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice low and final. "No matter how deeply you try to bury it." The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of the confession hanging heavy in the air. Carter sat motionless, defeated by the truth that had finally caught up with him. And in that moment, Miss Marple knew that the case had been solved, the final pieces falling into place. The web of deceit had been unraveled, and the shadows that had lingered over the estate were finally gone. Faraday stepped forward, his face hardening with determination. "You're under arrest, Mr. Carter," he said, his voice steady. Carter didn't resist. His shoulders slumped in resignation. The game was over, and for Miss Marple, the mystery had finally come to a close.